In April of 1823, nearly 100,000 French soldiers gathered at the base of the Pyrenees Mountains. They carried with them over 20,000 horses, more than 100 artillery pieces, and enough supplies to sustain a months-long campaign. Their commanding officer was the Duke of Angoulême, nephew to the King of France. Their mission was straightforward on paper: cross into Spain, march to Madrid, and restore King Ferdinand VII to absolute power. Ferdinand was technically still on his throne, but for 3 years he had been forced to govern as a constitutional monarch, bound by laws and a parliament he despised. He had written secret letters to every crowned head in Europe, begging them to send armies to rescue him from what he called the most ignominious slavery. Now France had answered that call, and to pay for this massive military operation, the French government had turned to an unlikely source: a 31-year-old banker whose family had been dealing coins in a Frankfurt ghetto just 2 generations earlier. His name was James de Rothschild, and in the spring of 1823 he underwrote the largest government loan of his young career, a bond issue worth approximately 462 million francs in nominal value that would help finance the destruction of Spanish democracy. But here's where the story gets strange. Just 15 years before this invasion, another French army had marched into Spain. Napoleon Bonaparte had sent over 300,000 of his best soldiers to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. What followed was one of the worst military catastrophes in French history. The Spanish people rose up in what they called the War of Independence. Guerrilla fighters, working in bands of dozens or hundreds, ambushed French supply columns and mountain passes. They executed prisoners. They mutilated the dead. Entire French battalions vanished into the landscape, never to return. Villages that welcomed the French one day might massacre them the next. The regular Spanish army, though often defeated in pitched battle, simply refused to surrender. They would retreat, regroup, and attack again. And behind it all, the British Army under the Duke of Wellington provided money, weapons, training, and eventually direct military support. After 7 years of grinding, brutal warfare, Napoleon had lost somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 soldiers. The Spanish ulcer, as he called it, drained resources he desperately needed elsewhere. Some historians argue that Spain was where Napoleon really lost his empire, not in the frozen wastes of Russia, but in the dusty hills of Castile. So when France decided to invade Spain again in 1823, every military observer in Europe expected a bloodbath. The British ambassador predicted the French would suffer tens of thousands of casualties. Liberal newspapers across Europe warned of another guerrilla war. Even some French generals privately doubted the mission. But none of that happened. The 1823 invasion lasted barely 6 months. The French suffered roughly 4,000 total casualties, most from disease rather than combat. There was exactly one significant battle. The guerrillas never materialized. The Spanish army melted away. And by October, Ferdinand VII was back to ruling as an absolute king, free to execute his enemies at will. Why? Why did the same country that had fought Napoleon for 7 years barely resist the French in 1823? Why did Spanish villages that had produced fierce guerrilla fighters suddenly welcome foreign invaders? Why did an invasion that should have been a catastrophe turn into a military parade? The answers lie not just in military strategy or political circumstance. They lie in money, in the bond markets of Paris and London, in the financial networks that the Rothschild family was building across Europe, and in the fundamentally different nature of these two invasions. Because in 1808, the French came as conquerors. In 1823, they came as something far more insidious: liberators. To understand how France bought an army and crushed a democracy, we need to go back 3 years, to a military camp in southern Spain, and to a lieutenant colonel who was about to accidentally change the world. On New Year's Day, 1820, Lieutenant Colonel Rafael del Riego y Flores stood before 1,200 soldiers in the small Andalusian town of Las Cabezas de San Juan. Riego was 34 years old, a veteran of the wars against Napoleon, and a man consumed by an idea. The idea was that Spain deserved better than the king who currently ruled it. The 1,200 men he addressed were part of a much larger force, nearly 20,000 soldiers assembled in Andalusia over the previous year. Their official mission was to board ships at Cadiz, sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and crush the rebellions that were tearing Spain's American colonies apart. This was 1820, and Spain was losing an empire. From Mexico to Argentina, colonial populations were rising up against Spanish rule. Simón Bolívar was liberating Venezuela and Colombia. José de San Martín was advancing through Chile toward Peru. The viceroyalties that had sent silver flowing to Madrid for 3 centuries were slipping away. King Ferdinand VII had assembled this expeditionary force to reverse the tide. But the expedition had been waiting for over a year, and the waiting had been devastating. The soldiers lived in disease-ridden camps. Yellow fever swept through the ranks. Pay was irregular. Food was insufficient. And the ships they were expected to board were rotting hulks that many believed would sink before reaching America. Everyone knew the real reason for the delay. The government was broke. Spain's treasury had been exhausted by decades of war, first against revolutionary France, then against Napoleon, then against its own colonies. The ships couldn't sail because there wasn't enough money to provision them properly. So these 20,000 men sat in Andalusia, watching their comrades die of fever, waiting for orders that never came, growing angrier by the day. Rafael del Riego saw an opportunity. What Riego proposed to those 1,200 soldiers was simple in concept and revolutionary in implication. He wanted to restore the Constitution of 1812. This constitution, called La Pepa, because it was promulgated on St. Joseph's Day, had been created during the war against Napoleon. While French armies occupied most of Spain, a rump government had assembled in the coastal city of Cadiz, the one major city that never fell to Napoleon. And in that besieged city, Spanish liberals had drafted the most progressive constitution in Europe. The Constitution of 1812 established national sovereignty. It created a unicameral parliament, the Cortes, with real legislative power. It guaranteed freedom of the press. It abolished the Inquisition. It limited the king's authority to dismiss ministers or dissolve parliament. It was, for its time, a genuinely radical document, and Ferdinand VII had destroyed it the moment he got the chance. Ferdinand had spent the Napoleonic years as a prisoner in France, a puppet of Napoleon who lived in comfortable captivity while his subjects fought and died. When Napoleon's empire collapsed in 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain as a supposed hero. The Spanish people had fought for 6 years in his name. His first act was to declare the Constitution null and void. His second was to arrest the liberal leaders who had written it. His third was to restore absolute royal power, including the Inquisition. For 6 years, he had ruled Spain as an absolute monarch, crushing every hint of liberal opposition, executing or imprisoning anyone who challenged his authority. By 1820, Spain was an economic ruin governed by a vindictive king who trusted no one. The treasury was empty. The colonies were in open revolt. The army was demoralized and unpaid, and 1,200 soldiers in Andalusia were about to change everything. Rafael del Riego's plan was not complicated. He would declare the restoration of the Constitution of 1812. He would arrest the commanding officers loyal to the king, and he would march through Andalusia, hoping that other military units would join him. It was, objectively, a desperate gamble. Military uprisings against Ferdinand had failed before. The leaders had been executed. There was no guarantee that the civilian population would support him. There was no guarantee that other army units would mutiny rather than obey orders to crush him. At first, it looked like the gamble had failed completely. Riego marched his column from town to town, proclaiming the Constitution and calling on citizens to rise up. The response was underwhelming. Most towns simply watched the soldiers pass through. Some local officials fled. Others politely declined to join the rebellion. Riego's force dwindled as men deserted or were detached to hold captured positions. By late January, Riego was down to fewer than 500 men. He had proclaimed the Constitution across Andalusia, but no one seemed to care. The royalist forces hadn't even bothered to attack him seriously. The whole enterprise seemed destined to peter out in embarrassing failure. Then, in the first week of February, everything changed. In La Coruña, in the far northwest of Spain, the garrison declared for the Constitution. Then Zaragoza, then Barcelona, then Pamplona, then Valencia. City by city, garrison by garrison, the Spanish army was mutinying. Not because they had coordinated with Riego, but because his revolt had broken the dam. Officers who had privately grumbled about Ferdinand suddenly saw that resistance was possible. Units that had been waiting for someone else to act first discovered that someone had acted. By early March, the revolt had reached Madrid itself. Crowds gathered in the streets. Army units surrounded the royal palace. And Ferdinand VII, the man who had crushed every liberal uprising for 6 years, found himself standing on a balcony, facing a city that had turned against him. On March 7, 1820, Ferdinand VII stood before his subjects and spoke words he clearly did not mean. "Let us march frankly, and I the first, along the constitutional path." He swore to uphold the Constitution of 1812. He summoned the courts. He appointed liberal ministers. And for the next 3 years, Spain would attempt an experiment in constitutional government. They called it the Trienio Liberal, the Liberal Triennium. 3 years that would terrify every monarch in Europe. The news of Spain's revolution spread across Europe within days, and in the courts of the great powers, it landed like a bomb. You have to understand what Europe looked like in 1820 to grasp why Spain mattered so much. The Napoleonic Wars had ended just 5 years earlier. Those wars had begun as a response to the French Revolution of 1789, the event that had decapitated a king, abolished feudal privileges, spread radical ideas of liberty and equality, and ultimately spawned Napoleon's attempt to conquer all of Europe. For over 20 years, the traditional monarchies of Europe had fought first revolutionary France, then Napoleonic France. Millions had died. Empires had been destroyed and rebuilt. The entire European order had been shattered and then painstakingly reconstructed. The monarchs who finally defeated Napoleon in 1815 had made a pact. They called it various things: the Concert of Europe, the Congress system, or most grandiosely, the Holy Alliance. The core principle was simple: never again. Never again would they allow revolution to spread from one country to another. Never again would they permit liberal or nationalist movements to threaten established thrones. If revolution broke out anywhere, the great powers would act together to crush it. This wasn't just ideology, it was survival strategy. Every major continental monarchy had nearly been destroyed by revolutionary France. The Austrian Habsburgs, the Prussian Hohenzollerns, the Russian Romanovs, and eventually even the French Bourbons themselves, all understood that revolution was contagious. If it succeeded in one country, it would spread to others. And now Spain had given them exactly the nightmare they feared. Within months of Riego's revolt, copycat uprisings exploded across southern Europe. In July 1820, military officers in Naples, inspired explicitly by the Spanish example, forced their king to accept a constitution modeled on Spain's. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the largest Italian state, had fallen to the revolutionaries. In August 1820, Portugal followed. A military junta overthrew the Regency government and demanded a constitutional convention. The Portuguese king, who had fled to Brazil during the Napoleonic Wars and never returned, suddenly found his European throne in jeopardy. In March 1821, Piedmont Sardinia, the most important Italian state after Naples, erupted in revolt. Again, the pattern was the same: military officers demanding a constitution, crowds in the streets, a terrified monarch forced to make concessions. August 1820, Portugal, March 1821, Piedmont. The monarchs of Europe had been right to be afraid. But revolution was spreading exactly as they had predicted. The Spanish disease was infecting the entire Mediterranean. Austria acted quickly in Italy. Austrian troops crushed the Neapolitan Revolution in March 1821, and the Piedmontese revolt shortly after. The Italian constitutional experiments were strangled in their cradles. But Spain was a different problem entirely. Spain was protected by the Pyrenees. There was no land route for Austrian or Russian troops to reach it. Any intervention would have to be primarily naval, or it would have to come from France, and France, in 1820, was not yet ready to act. The restored Bourbon monarchy of Louis XVIII was still finding its feet. The ultra-royalists who wanted intervention were balanced by more moderate voices who remembered what had happened the last time France invaded Spain. The French army had been rebuilt after 1815, but its reliability was uncertain. And there was another complicating factor: Britain. Britain opposed intervention. The British had fought alongside Spanish guerrillas against Napoleon. They had commercial interests in Spain, and even more in Spain's rebellious colonies. And the British political system was different enough from the continental monarchies that the government felt no particular horror at the idea of constitutional government in Spain. So for 2 years, the Spanish constitutional government survived. It was a turbulent survival. The liberals fought viciously among themselves. Moderate reformers clashed with radicals. The economy collapsed. King Ferdinand played both sides, publicly supporting the Constitution while secretly writing letters to foreign monarchs begging them to invade. But it survived, until the autumn of 1822, when Europe's monarchs gathered in an Italian city to decide Spain's fate. And everything changed. To understand why the great powers were so terrified of a liberal revolution in Spain, you need to understand the world they had just survived. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars had lasted, with brief interruptions, for 23 years. From 1792 to 1815, Europe had been convulsed by the most destructive conflict it had ever experienced. At least 5 million soldiers died, probably more. Civilian deaths may have doubled that number. Ancient dynasties had been overthrown. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed since Charlemagne, was dissolved. Poland disappeared from the map entirely. Every major European power was invaded at least once, and behind all the armies stood an idea that terrified Europe's rulers: popular sovereignty. The French Revolution had proclaimed that power came from the people, not from God through kings. It had guillotined a king and queen. It had abolished feudal privileges, confiscated church lands, and established the principle that citizens were equal before the law. These ideas had spread wherever French armies marched. They could not be unlearned. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814 and again in 1815, the victorious powers gathered in Vienna to reconstruct Europe. The Congress of Vienna was dominated by a handful of figures. Austria's Prince Metternich, the most brilliant diplomat of his generation, orchestrated the proceedings. Britain's Lord Castlereagh focused on balance of power. France's Talleyrand, amazingly, managed to secure France a place at the table, despite having just lost the war. And Russia's Tsar Alexander I loomed over everything, commanding the largest army in Europe. Metternich, Austria; lead orchestrator Castlereagh, Britain; balance of power, Talleyrand, France; representing the defeated Alexander I, Russia; military dominance. They redrew the map of Europe. France was pushed back to its 1792 borders. The German states were reorganized into the German Confederation. The Netherlands absorbed Belgium. Prussia expanded westward. Austria consolidated its Italian territories. But the Congress wasn't just about territory. It was about ideology. Tsar Alexander I, who had grown increasingly religious and mystical during the wars, proposed the Holy Alliance. This was a pact among Christian monarchs to govern their nations according to Christian principles and to support each other against revolutionary threats. Austria and Prussia signed, along with most other European states. Britain declined. Officially because the Prince Regent couldn't sign without parliamentary approval, actually because the whole thing seemed too vague and mystical for practical British tastes. In practice, the Holy Alliance meant that the great continental powers agreed to intervene against revolutions. If a liberal uprising threatened any throne, the others would help suppress it. Domestic affairs were no longer purely domestic if they threatened the international conservative order. The Congress system was the mechanism for implementing these principles. The great powers would meet regularly to discuss threats to European stability and coordinate responses. In 1818, they met at Aix-la-Chapelle to end the occupation of France and admit France to the concert of powers. The system seemed to be working. Napoleon's former enemies were cautiously accepting restored Bourbon France as a partner rather than a prisoner. In 1820, they met at Troppau as the Italian revolutions exploded. Austria was authorized to crush the Neapolitan and Piedmontese uprisings. The intervention happened quickly and successfully. In 1821, they continued discussions at Laibach. The Italian situation was under control, but Spain remained a problem. Spain was too far away for Austrian intervention. Russia offered troops, but marching a Russian army across Germany would raise all sorts of questions about Russian ambitions. And only France could realistically intervene in Spain, and France was hesitating. Britain was always the awkward partner in this system. Britain was itself a constitutional monarchy with a powerful parliament. The British government could not openly endorse the suppression of constitutional government abroad without inviting uncomfortable questions at home. More practically, Britain had commercial interests that diverged from continental powers. British merchants were trading with the revolting Spanish colonies. British investors were lending money to the new Latin American governments. A restored Spanish empire that reimposed colonial trading restrictions would hurt British business. Lord Castlereagh, who had helped build the Congress system, committed suicide in 1822. His successor, George Canning, was more overtly hostile to continental intervention policies. Canning believed that Britain should pursue its own interests, not subordinate them to a conservative European consensus. By the time the powers gathered at Verona in 1822, the British were already moving toward opposition. For Metternich and his allies, Spain was not just about Spain. It was about the entire European order. Liberal and nationalist ideas were spreading through underground networks. The Carbonari in Italy, the Charbonnerie in France, various Masonic lodges across Europe all served as conduits for revolutionary thought. Many of these networks looked to the Spanish Constitution as a model. The Constitution of 1812 was not just a Spanish document. It was becoming a European symbol. The Italian revolutionaries had demanded constitutions modeled on Spain's. Our Portuguese liberals had done the same. If Spain's constitutional experiment succeeded, it would demonstrate that constitutional government could work, that monarchs could be constrained, that the old order could be reformed or overthrown. Metternich understood this perfectly. He wrote that the Spanish Revolution has all the marks of a contagion which is spreading itself from state to state. If Spain survived, others would try. If others tried, the entire post-1815 order might collapse. There's something eerily familiar about this dynamic. Great powers feared that ideas, more than armies, threatened their stability. They believed that a successful example anywhere endangered order everywhere. They convinced themselves that intervention was not aggression but self-defense, that crushing liberty abroad protected stability at home. The specific ideologies change. The pattern recurs. In 1823, the conservative powers of Europe looked at Spain and saw a threat to everything they had built since 1815. They decided to act. This was the world in which Rafael del Riego stood up in Las Cabezas de San Juan on New Year's Day, 1820. He wasn't just starting a Spanish revolution. He was challenging the entire European order, and that order would eventually respond with an army, financed by the greatest banking network the world had ever seen, to crush everything he had started. Now let's see how it happened. Before we go to Verona, we need to understand what was actually happening in Spain during the 3 years of constitutional government, because the story is more complicated than heroes versus villains. The Spanish liberals who took power in 1820 were not a unified movement. They were a collection of factions with different visions for Spain's future, and they spent as much time fighting each other as fighting the king. The Moderados, the moderate liberals, wanted gradual reform. They believed in constitutional government, but they also believed in working with the king, with the church, and with traditional elites. They feared that radical change would provoke a backlash. Men like Francisco Martinez de la Rosa and the Conde de Torreno led this faction. They had suffered under Ferdinand's absolutism, but they also remembered the chaos of the French Revolution. They wanted to build a stable constitutional order, not unleash popular fury. The Moderados dominated the first constitutional government. They moved slowly on church reform, tried to conciliate Ferdinand, and avoided antagonizing the great landowners. Critics accused them of being timid, of not going far enough, of betraying the revolution. The exaltados, the radicals, wanted immediate and sweeping change. They distrusted Ferdinand absolutely. They wanted to purge royalists from the army and bureaucracy. They wanted to dismantle the church's economic power. They wanted to empower ordinary people through local militias and popular assemblies. The exaltados drew support from urban artisans, lower-ranking military officers, and young idealists who had grown up under Ferdinand's repression. They organized through political clubs and secret societies, especially the Masonic lodges that had spread through the Spanish military. The two factions fought constantly. 5 different ministries held power between 1820 and 1821 alone. Each government was weaker than the last, and each transition was more bitter. Meanwhile, Ferdinand played both sides. He publicly cooperated with whatever government was in power. Privately, he corresponded with foreign monarchs, with royalist conspirators, and with anyone who might help him escape constitutional constraints. While liberals fought each other, royalist resistance was organizing. The clergy, particularly rural priests, had never accepted the constitutional regime. The suppression of monasteries and the sale of church lands threatened their economic base. The anti-clerical rhetoric of the exaltados threatened their cultural authority. They preached against the godless constitution from pulpits across Spain. Many peasants followed their priests. The constitutional reforms offered them nothing tangible. Land sales benefited wealthy purchasers, not poor farmers. The abolition of feudal privileges meant little to people who had never held any. Meanwhile, the new liberal authorities demanded taxes and conscription just like the old regime. By 1822, armed royalist bands were operating in the countryside. In Catalonia, Navarre, and other traditional regions, the Army of the Faith was forming. These guerrillas used the same tactics that had destroyed Napoleon, now turned against the constitutional government. The Royalist uprising of 1822 nearly succeeded. In July, Royalist forces captured key positions around Madrid itself. A liberal officer named Rafael del Riego, the same man who had started the revolution, led the defense. The Royalists were defeated, but barely. The crisis demonstrated how weak the constitutional government really was. It held power in the cities, but the countryside was slipping away. The army was divided, the treasury was empty, and Ferdinand was still there, waiting. The constitutional government inherited a bankrupt state and made it worse. Spain's American colonies were the traditional source of silver and revenue. By 1820, most of them were in active revolt. The silver shipments that had sustained the Spanish treasury for 3 centuries had largely stopped. The constitutional government had neither the money nor the military capacity to reconquer the colonies. Domestic tax collection was chaotic. The old tax system had depended on royal authority and church cooperation. Both were now compromised. Regional governments resisted central demands. Tax evasion was rampant. Meanwhile, spending demands were enormous. The army needed to suppress royalist uprisings. The bureaucracy needed to be paid. The new national militia, created to defend the Constitution, consumed resources. Debts from decades of war remained unpaid. The government printed paper money that quickly lost value. Foreign credit was unavailable. By 1822, Spain was effectively bankrupt, unable to meet basic government functions. The constitutional government was isolated internationally almost from the start. Russia, Austria, and Prussia refused to recognize the legitimacy of the constitutional regime. Their ambassadors in Madrid reported continuously on Spanish instability. They urged their governments to intervene. France, under the restored Bourbons, was even more hostile. French ultra-royalists saw the Spanish Revolution as a direct threat. Liberal conspiracies had already been uncovered in France. A Spanish success might inspire French imitators. Even Britain, the nominal friend of Spanish liberalism, was unreliable. The British government valued stability above ideology. They wanted access to Spanish-American markets, which meant they actually preferred weak Spanish governments that could not reconquer the colonies. They would not lift a finger to save Spanish liberalism if it meant risking war with France. The constitutional government tried to negotiate with Europe. They sent ambassadors to explain that Spanish liberalism was not French Jacobinism, that they posed no threat to neighboring monarchies. Nobody was convinced. Through all of this, Ferdinand VII was playing his own game. Publicly, he performed the role of constitutional monarch. He attended ceremonies. He signed legislation. He received liberal ministers. He gave speeches praising the Constitution he despised. Privately, he was running multiple conspiracies. He corresponded with foreign monarchs through secret channels. He maintained contact with royalist conspirators inside Spain. He encouraged the Army of the Faith while officially condemning it. The most famous of these letters went to Tsar Alexander I in 1821. Ferdinand described his position as the most ignominious slavery and begged for international intervention. "For the love of God," he wrote, "hasten to tear me from this dire situation." The liberals knew Ferdinand was unreliable. They had spies who intercepted some of his correspondence. But they couldn't depose him without destroying the constitutional fiction they were trying to maintain. The Constitution required a king. Removing Ferdinand would mean either civil war or admitting that constitutional monarchy was impossible in Spain. By late 1822, the Spanish liberals faced a terrible choice. The Moderados wanted to consolidate, to strengthen the government, to make peace with the church and the traditional elites. They believed that if they could just survive long enough, the constitutional regime would become normalized. People would get used to it. Opposition would fade. The exaltados wanted to radicalize, to purge royalists more thoroughly, to arm the people through expanded militias, to break the power of the church entirely. They believed that half measures were fatal, that the revolution must advance or die. Both were probably wrong. The Moderados underestimated how deep the opposition ran. The exaltados underestimated how much radicalization would terrify neutral observers. There may have been no path to survival. Because by late 1822 the great powers were gathering in Verona, and they had already decided that Spain's experiment must end. In October 1822, the crowned heads of Europe gathered in the ancient Italian city of Verona. It would be the last great Congress of the post-Napoleonic era, and its decisions would reshape the political map of the Western world. The Congress of Verona brought together the most powerful men on the continent. Tsar Alexander I of Russia attended in person, the first time a Russian emperor had traveled so far west for a diplomatic meeting. Austria's Prince Metternich, the mastermind of European conservative politics, orchestrated the proceedings. Prussia sent its king, but France sent its foreign minister, the ultra-royalist Duc de Montmorency. Tsar Alexander I, Russia Prince Metternich, Austria Duc de Montmorency, France Duke of Wellington, Britain, reluctantly, sent the Duke of Wellington. Yes, that Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, the man who had spent years fighting in Spain against Napoleon, the general who probably understood Spanish warfare better than anyone else in that room. Wellington's instructions from London were simple: oppose intervention, make clear that Britain would not support, participate in, or condone any military action against the Spanish constitutional government. The British position was not entirely principled. Yes, Some British politicians genuinely sympathized with Spanish liberalism. But more importantly, Britain had commercial interests at stake. Spain's American colonies were in the process of becoming independent. British merchants wanted access to those markets. British investors were already making loans to the new Latin American governments. A restored, absolutist Spain might try to reconquer its colonies, disrupting British trade. A weakened constitutional Spain would be forced to accept Latin American independence. So Wellington came to Verona to say no, and everyone else came to decide how to proceed without him. The official agenda of the Congress of Verona covered several topics: the ongoing Greek revolt against Ottoman rule, political instability in Italy, the slave trade. But everyone knew the real subject was Spain. The Spanish constitutional government had become an embarrassment to every principle the Holy Alliance stood for. For 2.5 years, it had survived despite predictions of imminent collapse. Worse, it had become a beacon. Liberal conspirators across Europe looked to Spain as proof that constitutional government could work. Revolutionary societies, secret clubs, underground networks all drew inspiration from Riego's success. Metternich understood this dynamic clearly. He wrote privately that Spain represented the most dangerous and the most immediate menace to the stability of Europe. As long as the constitutional government survived, revolution remained thinkable. But Metternich was also cautious. He knew that intervention in Spain would be far more difficult than the quick Austrian campaigns that had crushed the Italian revolts. Spain was distant, protected by mountains, and the memory of Napoleon's disaster was fresh in everyone's mind. More importantly, an intervention would require France. Austria couldn't project military power across the Pyrenees. Russia's offer to march 150,000 troops across Germany was logistically questionable and politically dangerous. Only France had both the army and the geographic position to invade Spain effectively, and that meant the Congress would turn on what the French decided to do. France in 1822 was not a monolithic actor. The restored Bourbon monarchy contained factions that disagreed sharply about Spain. The ultra-royalists, led by men like Montmorency and the Comte d'Artois, the king's brother and future Charles X, wanted intervention. For them, crushing the Spanish liberals wasn't just about European stability. It was about proving that the restored Bourbon France could succeed where Napoleon had failed. It was about wiping away the humiliation of the Peninsular War. It was about demonstrating that monarchy could project power just as effectively as revolution. Succeed where Bonaparte was baffled. They also had a domestic motive. In 1820, the Duc de Berry, heir presumptive to the French throne, had been assassinated by a lone attacker. The ultra-royalists blamed liberal ideas for inspiring political violence. A successful war against liberalism abroad would strengthen their position at home. But the French Prime Minister Joseph de Villèle was more hesitant. Villèle was a pragmatist. He knew that France's treasury was not prepared for a major war. He knew that the army's loyalty was uncertain, filled with officers who had served Napoleon and might not enthusiastically fight for the Bourbons. He knew that liberal opposition in the French Parliament would attack any military adventure. Empty treasury, uncertain army loyalty, liberal opposition. Villèle had instructed Montmorency to attend the Congress, listen carefully, and commit to nothing. France would consider action, but only if the circumstances were right and the other powers provided clear support. Montmorency ignored these instructions completely. The Duc de Montmorency was an ultra-royalist ideologue who believed that crushing Spanish liberalism was a sacred duty. When he arrived at Verona, he did not wait and listen. He immediately put forward 3 provocative questions to the other powers. Would the Allies withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid in solidarity with France? Would they provide moral support for French action? And would they offer material assistance, including military support, if France intervened? These questions went far beyond his instructions. Villèle had told him to keep options open. Montmorency was trying to force France into a commitment before the cabinet had decided. Wellington immediately saw the trap. When pressed for Britain's position on hypothetical scenarios, he replied with deliberate vagueness. Having no knowledge of the cause of dispute, and not being able to form a judgment upon a hypothetical case, he could give no answer. But the other powers were eager. Tsar Alexander I saw an opportunity to extend Russian influence into Western European affairs. He offered to station 150,000 Russian troops in Piedmont as a reserve force for the Spanish intervention. Why, he wanted to be seen as the defender of Christian monarchy against the forces of atheistic revolution. Metternich was uncomfortable with Russia's enthusiasm, but recognized that the Spanish situation had to be resolved. He agreed to support France diplomatically, calculating that French intervention would solve the Spanish problem without requiring Austrian resources. Prussia, as usual, followed Austria's lead. The Prussian position was initially skeptical. Their representative noted that France was in no way threatened by Spanish liberalism and questioned the need for intervention. But when Austria and Russia aligned in favor of action, Prussia fell into line. Russia, strongly in favor. Austria, in favor, with reservations. Prussia, initially skeptical, ultimately agreed. Britain. Opposed by the end of October 1822, the Continental Powers had agreed. Russia, Austria, and Prussia would withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid and publicly support whatever action France chose to take. Britain stood alone in opposition. Wellington knew what this meant. He knew that Britain could not prevent French intervention, and he knew that British opposition would not stop the invasion, but would only isolate Britain from the Continental consensus. As he prepared to leave Verona, Wellington told the French delegation something remarkable. In French, he said, "Je crois que vous faites mal d'adopter les mesures que vous venez de prendre, mais je souhaite de tout mon cœur que vous réussissiez." I believe you are wrong to adopt the measures you have just taken, but I wish with all my heart that you succeed. It was a strange statement from a man who officially opposed the intervention, but Wellington understood something that ideologues often miss. If France invaded Spain and failed, the result would be chaos across Europe. Revolutionary movements everywhere would be emboldened. The Congress system would collapse. The fragile post-Napoleonic order would shatter. Better, from Wellington's perspective, for France to win quickly than to lose slowly. When news of Verona reached Paris, Prime Minister Villèle was furious. Montmorency had exceeded his instructions and committed France to a course of action that Villèle had not approved. The two men clashed openly. By the end of December, Montmorency had resigned. His replacement was one of the most famous writers in France, François-René de Chateaubriand. Chateaubriand was a romantic in both the literary and personal sense. He had written influential novels and memoirs. He had traveled to America and the Middle East. He was vain, brilliant, and convinced of his own historical importance. And he wanted war. For Chateaubriand, the Spanish intervention was not just politics. It was poetry. It was France rising from the ashes of Napoleonic defeat to reclaim its place as a great power. It was the Bourbon monarchy proving that it could do what Bonaparte could not. He would later write, "To stride over the Spains, to succeed where Bonaparte was baffled, to do in 6 months what he could not do in 7 years. Here is a true prodigy." With Chateaubriand as foreign minister, the intervention was no longer a question of if, but when. On January 28, 1823, Louis XVIII addressed the French chambers. He was 67 years old, obese, and suffering from gout so severe he could barely walk. But his words were clear. 100,000 Frenchmen, commanded by a prince of my family, are about to march, invoking the God of St. Louis, to preserve the throne of Spain for a descendant of Henri IV. The invocation was deliberate. St. Louis, King Louis IX, had been a crusader. The name connected this modern military intervention to medieval holy wars. The Bourbons were presenting themselves as defenders of faith and legitimate monarchy against the forces of revolution. The phrase 100,000 sons of St. Louis stuck immediately. Les 100,000 fils de St. Louis. And it became the name by which history would remember this expedition. But assembling 100,000 soldiers and sending them into Spain would require something the French government did not have: money. The French Parliament had authorized 100 million francs for the Spanish expedition. This money would come from two sources: a budget surplus of 42 million francs from the previous year, and new government bonds worth 58 million francs. Available surplus, 42 million francs. New bonds needed, 58 million francs. It sounded straightforward, but the reality was more complicated. First, the 100 million franc authorization would prove wildly insufficient. The actual cost of the invasion would exceed 200 million francs, more than double the original budget. Supplying an army across the Pyrenees, paying soldiers, feeding horses, transporting artillery, all of it cost far more than optimistic planners had projected. Second, selling 58 million francs in new government bonds was not as simple as it sounded. Bond markets in the 1820s were sensitive and skeptical. Investors had seen governments default. They had seen currencies collapse. They had seen wars drain treasuries into bankruptcy. When Louis XVIII announced the Spanish intervention, French government bonds immediately dropped in value. The 5% rente, the benchmark French government security, fell from 87 francs to 78 francs in a matter of weeks. A 10% drop in just days. Investors were voting with their money. They feared that the Spanish War would be expensive, prolonged, and possibly disastrous. They feared another peninsular war. They feared that France would have to borrow far more than planned, while diluting the value of existing bonds. The French government needed someone who could reassure the markets, someone who could organize a massive bond issue, someone with access to capital not just in Paris but across Europe. They needed the Rothschilds. James de Rothschild had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. At 31 years old, James was the youngest of the 5 Rothschild brothers who had established banking houses across Europe. He had arrived in Paris in 1812, during the last years of Napoleon's empire, and had slowly built the French branch of the family business into a formidable institution. But he was still an outsider. The established French banking families, the Lafittes and Perriers, looked down on this German Jewish newcomer. He had won some government business, but the really big contracts had eluded him. The Spanish War loan would change that. In February 1823, the French government announced a new bond issue. They would sell 462 million francs in nominal bonds, securities that would be repaid at face value in the future for approximately 80 to 82% of face value. The difference between the sale price and the face value represented both the interest rate and a discount for risk. This was the largest French government loan since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and for the first time, de Rothschild Frères won the primary contract, displacing the established banking houses that had dominated French government finance for decades. James bid aggressively. He committed Rothschild capital not just from Paris but from London, his brother Nathan, Frankfurt, his brother Amschel, and Vienna, his brother Salomon. The family network that Meyer Amschel Rothschild had built specifically for moments like this. The winning bid secured approximately 23.1 million francs in annual government rent payments, representing roughly 18.5 million pounds sterling in capital. This was the first time a Rothschild bank had served as primary underwriter for a major French government loan. First major French government loan for de Rothschild Frères. It would not be the last. As James de Rothschild organized the bond issue in Paris, 95,000 French soldiers gathered at the Spanish border. The army was organized into 4 main corps plus a reserve. The overall commander was Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, the 47-year-old nephew of King Louis XVIII. Angoulême had limited combat experience, having served mainly in émigré units during the Revolutionary Wars. But he was a prince of the blood, and symbolism mattered. Total force, approximately 95,000 troops artillery, 96 to 108 pieces cavalry, 20,000 horses. The real military direction came from experienced Napoleonic veterans. Men like Marshal Oudinot, Marshal Moncey, and General Molitor had fought across Europe under Bonaparte. Their presence was both reassuring and politically sensitive. The Bourbon monarchy was sending an army led by Napoleon's marshals to accomplish what Napoleon himself had failed to do. By late March, everything was ready. The money was arranged, the army was assembled. The diplomatic groundwork was complete. On April 6, 1823, a bizarre incident marked the eve of invasion. Approximately 500 liberal volunteers, including French Republicans, Italian exiles, and Spanish sympathizers, gathered at the Bidassoa River crossing. They waved tricolor flags, sang La Marseillaise, and attempted to incite the French troops to mutiny. The French commander ordered his men to open fire. Several volunteers were killed. The rest fled. It was the last liberal resistance the French would encounter for weeks. The next morning, April 7, 1823, the 100,000 sons of St. Louis crossed into Spain. On April 7, 1823, the French army crossed into Spain without a formal declaration of war. There were no border skirmishes. No Spanish forces contested the crossing. The invasion began almost as a parade. The army advanced in 4 main columns. The First Corps, under Marshal Oudinot, pushed down the western route toward Vitoria and Burgos. The Second Corps, under General Molitor, advanced through the pass of Roncesvalles toward Pamplona. The Fourth Corps, under Marshal Moncey, targeted Catalonia in the east. The reserve under General Bourdasoul followed the main advance, ready to reinforce wherever needed. First Corps, Marshal Oudinot; Western Route Second Corps, General Molitor; Central Route Fourth Corps, Marshal Moncey; Catalonia Reserve, General Bourdasoul. The original plan called for a cautious, methodical advance. French commanders expected serious resistance. They expected guerrillas. They expected to spend months fighting through northern Spain before they could even approach Madrid. Instead, they encountered something they hadn't anticipated: almost nothing. To understand why the 1823 invasion succeeded so easily, you have to understand why the 1808 invasion failed so catastrophically. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, he was deposing a legitimate dynasty. He forced both the king and crown prince to abdicate, then placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people didn't see this as liberation. They saw it as conquest. The resulting uprising wasn't just military, it was national. Priests preached holy war from pulpits. Village councils organized resistance. Peasants who had never held weapons before learned to ambush French patrols. The guerrilleros weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers and craftsmen and shepherds fighting for their faith, their land, and their king. And they had a powerful ally. Britain poured money, weapons, and eventually a full army under Wellington into the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish regulars might lose pitched battles, but they kept fighting. Every French victory was followed by a Spanish regrouping. Every conquered town might rebel the moment the French garrison moved on. But 1823 was fundamentally different. This time, the French weren't deposing the Spanish king. They were restoring him. Ferdinand VII had never stopped claiming that the constitutional government was illegitimate. He had never stopped writing to foreign monarchs, begging for rescue. When the French army crossed the border, they carried proclamations stating that they came not as conquerors but as liberators. They came to free Spain from the tyranny of revolution, and a significant portion of the Spanish population believed them. The Spanish countryside in 1823 was not the united patriotic mass of 1808. It was deeply divided. The constitutional government had enacted reforms that hurt powerful interests. The suppression of monasteries alienated the church, while land sales from confiscated church property created resentment among peasants who couldn't afford to buy. Anti-clerical rhetoric offended religious conservatives, and the constitutional government had failed to deliver economic recovery. After 3 years of liberal rule, Spain was still bankrupt, still losing its colonies, still unable to pay soldiers or officials. The idealism of 1820 had given way to disillusionment. Economic collapse continued. Colonial losses accelerated. Internal divisions paralyzed government. So when the French army advanced into Spain, they found something remarkable. Spanish royalists came out to welcome them. Even before the French invasion, Spanish royalists had begun organizing. In 1822, ultra-royalist guerrilla bands, styling themselves the Army of the Faith, had been fighting the constitutional government in northern Spain. These weren't ordinary bandits. They were the same population that had produced the anti-Napoleonic guerrillas 15 years earlier, the same villages, the same families, the same priests who had preached holy war against the French in 1808 were now preaching holy war alongside the French in 1823. The irony was spectacular. Men who had ambushed French supply columns in 1810 were now guiding French columns through mountain passes in 1823. Villages that had massacred French soldiers during the Peninsular War were now providing food and shelter to French soldiers during the Restoration invasion. By the time the invasion began, approximately 30,000 Spanish royalists were already under arms. They knew the terrain. They knew where liberal sympathizers lived. They served as scouts, guides, and enforcers for the French advance. Against this combined force, the constitutional government could muster only about 50,000 demoralized regular troops. Many Spanish officers had already made secret arrangements to surrender. Others simply melted away as the French approached. The numbers told the story. Over 120,000 French and Royalist troops against 50,000 divided, demoralized defenders. Without guerrilla resistance to slow the advance, without British support to stiffen the regulars, without popular enthusiasm to sustain the fight, the liberal cause was hopeless from the start. The French advance was so rapid that it seemed to take everyone by surprise, including the French commanders themselves. By late April, the First Corps had reached Burgos. By early May, they were approaching Madrid. The constitutional government, realizing the capital could not be defended, made a fateful decision. They would flee south, taking King Ferdinand with them. The Cortes voted to relocate first to Seville, then ultimately to Cadiz, the same coastal fortress that had held out against Napoleon during the Peninsular War. On May 23rd and 24th, French forces entered Madrid without firing a shot. The city that Napoleon's armies had fought and bled to capture surrendered peacefully. The French established a regency government and declared Ferdinand VII restored to his rightful powers. But there was a problem. Ferdinand himself was still in liberal hands, being carried south toward Cadiz. The war could not be truly over until the king was physically freed. So the French pressed on. General Molitor's Second Corps led the pursuit into Andalusia. His mission was to catch the liberal army, free the king, and end the war. The pursuit became a series of capitulations. Spanish commanders, seeing the hopelessness of their position, negotiated surrenders. Many extracted promises of amnesty for their troops before laying down their arms. General Francisco Ballesteros, a distinguished veteran of the Peninsular War, who commanded the largest remaining liberal field force of about 12,000 men, was defeated at the Battle of Campillo de Arenas on July 28th. A week later, he capitulated entirely. Ballesteros surrenders August 4th. Rafael del Riego himself, the man who had started it all, tried to lead resistance in the south. His columns were routed near Jaén. Riego fled, was betrayed by a peasant, and captured by royalist forces on September 15th. The man who had proclaimed the Constitution and sparked the Trienio Liberal was now a prisoner, awaiting execution by the king he had tried to constrain. Meanwhile, the main drama was unfolding at Cadiz. Cadiz was the liberal government's last hope. This ancient port city sat on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. It was protected by massive fortifications. During the Peninsular War, Cadiz had held out against French siege for 2.5 years. It was here that the 1812 Constitution had been written. It was here that Spanish liberalism had been born. The constitutional government hoped that Cadiz could hold long enough for something to change. Perhaps Britain would finally intervene. Perhaps French domestic opposition would force a withdrawal. Perhaps the siege would drag on through the winter, sapping French strength and morale. But first, they faced an immediate crisis. Ferdinand VII refused to continue fleeing. When the government tried to move him from Seville to Cadiz, he resisted, claiming illness. On June 11th to 12th, the Cortes took an extraordinary step. They voted to declare the king temporarily morally impeded, essentially incapacitated, allowing them to legally compel him to relocate. Ferdinand was carried bodily to the coast and transported to Cadiz on June 15th. It was a constitutional procedure, technically legal under the system the liberals had created, but it would give Ferdinand the perfect justification for his later vengeance. He would never forgive being declared mentally incapable by men he considered traitors. The French army arrived before Cadiz in late June. The Duke of Angoulême established his headquarters and began planning the siege. The city's defenses were formidable, but they depended on controlling the surrounding positions. The most important of these was the Trocadero, a fortified peninsula in the Bay of Cadiz that commanded the sea approaches. Fort San Luis on the Trocadero was defended by about 1,700 Spanish troops under Colonel Garcés. The position was strong. The first French assault, on July 16th, was repulsed with significant casualties. For 6 weeks, the siege seemed stalemated. The French bombarded. The Spanish held. Negotiations went nowhere. As summer turned to early autumn, some observers wondered if Cadiz might actually hold. Then came the night of August 30 to 31. General Guy Mignot, Angoulême's chief of staff, planned the decisive assault with care. Also, he had observed that at low tide, the seaward approach to the Trocadero was accessible but lightly defended. The Spanish expected any attack to come from the landward side. Under cover of darkness, approximately 4,000 French infantry moved into position. At low tide, in the early hours of August 31st, they attacked. The assault achieved complete surprise. French troops scaled the seaward walls before the garrison could react. In vicious close-quarters fighting, they overwhelmed the defenders. Spanish casualties, approximately 150 killed, 300 wounded, 1,100 plus captured by dawn. Fort St. Louis was in French hands. The entire garrison, over 1,100 men, had been killed, wounded, or captured. French losses were remarkably light, 35 dead and 110 wounded. The Battle of Trocadero was the only significant military engagement of the entire Spanish campaign, and it lasted less than a night. With the Trocadero in French hands, Cadiz's position became untenable. French batteries could now bombard the city from close range. Admiral Duperrey's naval squadron tightened the blockade. Fort Sancti Petri fell on September 20th. On September 23rd, a coordinated bombardment from land and sea pounded the city. Inside Cadiz, the liberal government faced a choice. They could fight to the death, turning the city into rubble around them. Or they could negotiate. They chose negotiation. On September 30th, the Cortes formally dissolved itself and released Ferdinand VII. The king had extracted a promise. He would grant a general, complete, and absolute forgetting of everything past. Full amnesty, no reprisals, a clean slate. Ferdinand agreed readily. He signed the declaration. He swore to honor it. And everyone in that room knew he was lying. The next morning, Ferdinand crossed the bay from Cadiz to El Puerto de Santa Maria, where the Duke of Angoulême was waiting to receive him. Angoulême urged moderation. He counseled the king to extend the amnesty as much as possible. He warned that harsh reprisals would destabilize Spain and embarrass France. Ferdinand's response was to shout, "Viva el Rey Absoluto!" Long live the absolute king. Before leaving El Puerto de Santa Maria, Ferdinand issued a decree that would define the next decade of Spanish history. Ferdinand declared every act of the constitutional government null and void. Every law passed by the courts, every appointment made by liberal ministers, every treaty signed, every reform enacted, every pardon granted, all of it erased, as if the previous 3 years had never happened. But that wasn't all. The decree also declared that Ferdinand had been held in the most ignominious slavery by a handful of conspirators. It explicitly repudiated the amnesty he had promised just hours earlier, and it announced the restoration of absolute royal power in all its forms. The liberals who had trusted Ferdinand's word found themselves under arrest before the day was out. The White Terror was beginning. Angoulême was disgusted. He refused Ferdinand's offer of the title Prince of Trocadero and quickly distanced himself from the royal vengeance. But there was nothing he could do. The French army had restored Ferdinand to power. What Ferdinand did with that power was now his own affair. The last liberal strongholds fell in the weeks that followed. Pamplona, which had been under siege since April, surrendered on September 16th. San Sebastian fell on September 27th. Barcelona, the largest city still in liberal hands, capitulated on November 2nd. Alicante, the final holdout, surrendered on November 9th. Pamplona, September 16th. San Sebastian, September 27th. Barcelona, November 2nd. Alicante, November 9th. By mid-November 1823, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis had completed their mission. Spain was once again an absolute monarchy. Constitutional government had been crushed, and Ferdinand VII was free to take his revenge. On October 7, 1823, Ferdinand VII's decree of nullification was published in the Gaceta de Madrid, Spain's official government newspaper. The language was carefully chosen to maximize the damage. Ferdinand declared that the previous 3 years represented the most ignominious slavery, which a handful of conspirators and obscure and ambitious soldiers managed to impose on me. Note the framing. Not a constitutional experiment, not a political disagreement. Slavery, conspiracy, treason. Ferdinand was establishing the legal basis for vengeance. If the constitutional government had been a criminal conspiracy, then everyone who had participated in it was a criminal, and Ferdinand was prepared to treat them as such. The man who had started it all, Rafael del Riego, had been captured on September 15, 1823. He was transported to Madrid under heavy guard, charged with lèse majesté, treason against the sovereign. The trial was a formality. Riego's crime was undeniable. He had led the revolt that forced Ferdinand to accept the Constitution. Under absolutist law, this was treason punishable by death. But Ferdinand wanted more than just an execution. He wanted humiliation. In prison, Riego was broken. Whether through torture, psychological pressure, or simple despair, he signed a recantation of his liberal convictions. He renounced everything he had fought for. He begged for mercy. Historians still debate whether this recantation was genuine or extracted under duress. Some argue that Riego maintained his principles in private while publicly submitting to save his life. Others suggest that months of imprisonment, the certainty of death, and perhaps physical abuse genuinely broke him. It didn't matter. Ferdinand was not interested in mercy. On November 7, 1823, Rafael del Riego was executed in the Plaza de la Cebada in Madrid. But execution was not enough. Ferdinand ordered that Riego be publicly degraded before death. The man who had once been a national hero, whose name was sung in the streets, whose revolt had inspired constitutional movements across Europe, was dragged through Madrid in a wicker basket. Witnesses reported that Riego wept during the procession. He clutched a religious image and prayed aloud. Whether this was genuine religious devotion, terror, or complete psychological collapse, we cannot know. He was hanged in front of a crowd that included both royalist spectators celebrating and silent sympathizers who dared not protest. Some accounts suggest his body was decapitated after death, the head displayed as a warning. The Himno de Riego, the anthem composed in his honor during the Trienio Liberal, was banned. It would later be adopted as the anthem of the Spanish First Republic and the Second Republic, a symbol of liberal resistance to absolutism. But that was decades away. In November 1823, Rafael del Riego was just another dead traitor, and the killing was only beginning. Ferdinand's vengeance extended far beyond the liberal leadership. He wanted to purge every trace of constitutionalism from Spanish society. The instrument was the Juntas de Purificación, purification commissions. These bodies were established in every province, in every ministry, in every military unit. Their mission was to investigate everyone who had held any position during the Trienio Liberal and determine whether they were loyal to the restored absolute monarchy. Military officers were purged from the army. Government officials were dismissed from their posts. Professors were expelled from universities. Judges were removed from courts. Anyone who had shown enthusiasm for the Constitution, anyone who had implemented liberal reforms, anyone who had expressed constitutional opinions was subject to investigation. The purifications affected tens of thousands of people. Even those found innocent enough to retain their positions lived under constant suspicion. A denunciation from a neighbor, a rival, or an old enemy could reopen any case. Among the most tragic victims was Juan Martín Díaz, known as El Empecinado, the Stubborn One. El Empecinado had been one of the greatest guerrilla leaders of the war against Napoleon. For 6 years, he had led bands of fighters against the French occupation. He had become a national hero, a symbol of Spanish resistance, one of the men who had made Napoleon's Spanish ulcer bleed. During the Trienio Liberal, El Empecinado had supported the constitutional government. He believed in the principles of 1812. He believed that Spain deserved representative government and limits on royal power. For this, Ferdinand VII condemned him to death. El Empecinado was imprisoned for over 20 months under brutal conditions. Ferdinand, impatient for his death, reportedly wrote to a confidant, "It's time to dispatch to the other world El Empecinado." On August 19, 1825, Juan Martín Díaz, the guerrilla hero who had helped save Spain from Napoleon, was hanged by the king whose throne he had helped preserve. The irony was complete. The man who had fought for 6 years against a French invasion was killed by a king restored to power by a French invasion. Not all of Ferdinand's victims were soldiers or politicians. Some were simply people who believed in the wrong ideas. Mariana Pineda was a young widow in Granada, mother of 2 children. She came from a family with liberal sympathies. During the Década Ominosa, she became involved with underground liberal networks, helping to hide fugitives and pass messages. In 1831, police searched her home and found a flag. It was embroidered with the words law, liberty, equality, the slogans of constitutional liberalism. For possessing a flag, Mariana Pineda was sentenced to death. The authorities offered her a chance to save herself. If she would name her co-conspirators, identify the other members of the liberal underground, she would be spared. She refused. On May 26, 1831, at the age of 26, Mariana Pineda was executed by Garrote Ville, the iron collar that slowly strangled its victims. She became a martyr to the liberal cause, later immortalized in a play by Federico Garcia Lorca. Her story captured something about the nature of Ferdinand's repression. It wasn't just about eliminating military and political leaders. It was about crushing any spirit of resistance, any belief that things could be different, any hope for a better Spain. The repression required enforcement. Ferdinand couldn't rely on the regular army, which was riddled with officers of uncertain loyalty. He needed a new force, one that owed everything to him. The Voluntarios Realistas, the Royal Volunteers, were created on June 10, 1823, even before the fall of Cadiz. They were designed as the absolutist counterpart to the liberal national militia that had supported the constitutional government. Peak strength, approximately 200,000 members. By 1826, the Voluntarios Realistas numbered approximately 200,000 men, organized into 486 infantry battalions, 20 artillery companies, and 52 cavalry squadrons. They were drawn overwhelmingly from artisans, laborers, and rural workers, people who had gained nothing from liberal reforms and resented the changes the constitutional government had imposed. The volunteers served as political police. They patrolled streets looking for seditious activity. They arrested suspected liberals. They raided homes, searching for banned books and documents. they enforced attendance at religious services, which had become a marker of political loyalty. The Minister of Justice, Francisco Tadeo Calomarde, was the architect of this system. He created a network of spies, informers, and secret police that penetrated every level of Spanish society. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Servants reported on masters. Children were encouraged to report suspicious statements by their parents. The Spain of the Década Ominosa was a surveillance state built on fear and denunciation. Faced with imprisonment or death, thousands of Spanish liberals fled the country. London became a major center of Spanish exile. The British government, which had opposed the intervention, was willing to shelter its victims. Some exiles received stipends from the British government in recognition of their service during the Peninsular War. Paris hosted another exile community, more discreet given French responsibility for the intervention. Malta, then under British control, became a way station, and the newly independent nations of Latin America, the former Spanish colonies, when he welcomed refugees who had often supported their independence movements. London, largest community Paris, discreet presence. Malta, British-controlled way station Latin America, former colonies. The first amnesty, announced in May 1824, was so riddled with exceptions that it actually prompted more flight rather than returns. Liberal generals, Cortes deputies, government ministers, journalists, professors, military officers, anyone who had held significant position during the Trienio Liberal remained excluded. Meaningful return would not be possible until the regency of Maria Cristina in 1832, and definitive amnesty came only after Ferdinand's death in September 1833. For 10 years, Spanish liberalism survived primarily in exile, in underground networks, and in the memories of those who had lived through the Trienio Liberal and believed that someday, somehow, Spain would try again. How many people died in Ferdinand's repression? Precise figures are difficult to establish. The Década Ominosa was not a systematically documented genocide. It was a decade of institutionalized violence, arbitrary arrests, summary executions, and deaths in prison. Some historians estimate that approximately 30,000 people were executed during the 10-year period. Another 20,000 may have died in prison or as a result of their treatment. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned for shorter periods, purged from their positions, or forced into exile. Approximately 30,000 executed, approximately 20,000 died in prison. Tens of thousands imprisoned, purged, or exiled. These numbers are necessarily approximate. Records were incomplete. Many deaths were never officially recorded. Some victims simply disappeared. What we can say with certainty is that Ferdinand VII's restoration destroyed the Spanish liberal movement for a generation. The men and women who had believed in constitutional government, who had risked everything for the principles of 1812, were dead, imprisoned, or scattered across the globe. The 100,000 sons of St. Louis had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. They had invaded Spain, crushed the constitutional government, and restored Ferdinand VII to absolute power. The military cost had been minimal. The human cost was catastrophic. The Duke of Angoulême had tried to prevent the worst of the repression. In August 1823, while the siege of Cadiz was still underway, he had issued the Ordinance of Andújar. This order stripped Spanish royalist authorities of the power to make political arrests, reserving that authority to French military commanders. Angoulême hoped to prevent arbitrary vengeance and establish some framework of legality. The Spanish royalists revolted against this restriction. What was supposed to be French leadership of the Restoration became a confrontation between French moderation and Spanish fanaticism. Under pressure from Paris, from the Holy Alliance, and from Ferdinand himself, Angoulême was forced to revoke the ordinance on August 26th. French authority over Spanish internal affairs collapsed. Historian Emilio Laparra wrote that from October 1823 onward, France watched almost powerlessly as vengeance and repression were carried out by a power where legitimacy was associated with excess rather than moderation. The French army remained in Spain as an occupation force until 1828. They served mainly to deter any liberal counterattack and to provide a veneer of international legitimacy to Ferdinand's rule. But they could not, or would not, stop the killing. The 100,000 sons of St. Louis had delivered Spain to Ferdinand VII. What he did with it was no longer their concern. We've told you the story of the invasion, the armies, the battles, the executions. But we haven't yet answered the fundamental question that made all of it possible. Who paid for it? An army of 95,000 men doesn't march on idealism. It marches on logistics, food, horses, ammunition, uniforms, boots, on medical supplies, pay for soldiers, pay for officers, pay for the civilian contractors who kept the whole machine running. The French Parliament had authorized 100 million francs for the Spanish expedition. The actual cost exceeded 200 million francs, more than double the budget. That gap had to be filled somehow. Understanding how it was filled means understanding the strange and complicated world of early 19th century government finance. It means understanding how bond markets worked, why they mattered, and how a family of Jewish bankers from Frankfurt became essential to the military ambitions of Christian kings. It means understanding the Rothschilds. To understand the Rothschild role in 1823, you need to understand how the family worked. Meyer Amschel Rothschild had started as a coin dealer in the Frankfurt Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto where his family had lived for generations. Jews in 18th century Frankfurt were confined to a single street, forbidden from most trades, subject to special taxes, and required to return to the ghetto each night before the gates closed. Founder of the dynasty within these constraints, Meyer Amschel built a business dealing in coins and antiquities. He cultivated relationships with German aristocrats, particularly Wilhelm IX of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest princes in Europe. When Wilhelm fled Napoleon's armies in 1806, he entrusted much of his fortune to Rothschild management. But Meyer Amschel's real genius was understanding that the future lay not in coins, but in credit, and his masterstroke was his 5 sons, the Amschel, Frankfurt, Salomon, Vienna, Nathan, London, Karl, Naples, James, Paris. Each son established a banking house in a different European capital. They communicated constantly through a network of couriers, using a private code that combined German, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Information traveled through the Rothschild network faster than through any government postal system, and they had an iron rule. The family acts as one. When Nathan in London committed to a financial operation, his brothers in Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples would support it. When James in Paris needed capital, he could draw on resources across the entire network. This gave the Rothschilds something no other banking family possessed: the ability to mobilize capital across national boundaries, to absorb risks that would break a single city bank, and to make commitments that spanned the entire European financial system. To understand Rothschild's role in the 1823 invasion, you need to understand how governments borrowed money in this era. Governments spent money on armies, navies, civil administration, royal courts, and public works. This spending was supposed to be covered by taxes, but taxes were often insufficient, especially during wars or economic crises. When expenses exceeded revenues, governments had to borrow. They borrowed by issuing bonds. A government bond was essentially a promise: lend us money today, and we'll pay you back with interest over time. In France, the standard government security was called the rente, a perpetual bond that paid a fixed percentage, usually 5%, of its face value each year, forever. Annual payment, 5% of face value duration, perpetual. These bonds traded on financial markets. If investors were confident the government would keep paying, prices rose. If confidence fell, prices dropped. When Louis XVIII announced the Spanish invasion in January 1823, French rents immediately fell from 87 francs to 78 francs. Investors were betting that war would strain the treasury. Selling new bonds into a falling market was difficult. Investors wanted higher returns to compensate for higher risks. The government needed a banker who could organize the sale, absorb some of the risk, and convince investors that the bonds were worth buying. This was what the Rothschilds did. James de Rothschild had been building the Paris house since 1812. He was 31 years old in 1823, ambitious, aggressive, all and desperate to prove himself against the established French banking families. The established houses, Laffitte, Hautanguet, Perrier, had dominated French government finance for years. They had the relationships, the track records, the social connections. James was the outsider, the German, the Jew. But James had the network. When the government announced its bond issue in February 1823, he could commit capital not just from Paris, but from London, Frankfurt, and Vienna. He could place bonds with investors across multiple markets simultaneously. 462 million francs nominal value, approximately 370 million francs raised. James bid aggressively. The government was selling approximately 462 million francs in nominal bonds, meaning bonds that would be repaid at face value in the future. Now, James's consortium offered to buy them at roughly 80 to 82 centimes on the franc, meaning about 370 million francs in actual cash. De Rothschild Frères won the contract. For the first time, a Rothschild bank had served as primary underwriter for a major French government loan, displacing the established houses that had dominated the field. The annual rent payments from this loan amounted to approximately 23.1 million francs, representing roughly 18.5 million pounds sterling in capital. It was a massive commitment, and it was just the beginning. The gamble paid off spectacularly. As news of French military success filtered back to Paris, the bond market rallied. The rentes that had fallen to 78 began climbing. By the time the Duke of Angoulême entered Madrid in May, they had recovered to 87. By the fall of Cadiz in October, they were trading above 90. January 78 was 87. October 90 plus. James de Rothschild and his brothers had bought government bonds at the bottom and sold them as they rose. The exact profits are difficult to calculate, but they were substantial. More importantly, they had established themselves as France's premier government banker. Between 1823 and 1847, de Rothschild Frères would underwrite 7 major French government loans totaling approximately 1.5 billion francs. The 1823 war loan was the foundation of that dominance, but the Rothschild loan was only part of the financial story. The other part involves a very different kind of financier, Gabriel Julien Ouvrard. Ouvrard was a legendary figure in French financial circles. He had made and lost fortunes multiple times during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. He was brilliant, unscrupulous, and connected to powerful people who preferred not to be connected to him publicly. For the Spanish expedition, Ouvrard won the contract to provision the French army. This meant supplying food, fodder, transport, and various other necessities. It was exactly the kind of contract where fortunes could be made through inflated prices and creative accounting. And Ouvrard made the most of it. Historical research suggests that Ouvrard's provisioning charges were approximately double the normal rates. His contracts consumed roughly 75% of the 107.8 million franc budget overrun that the invasion experienced. Approximately 2 times normal rates consumed approximately 75% of budget overrun. The scandal eventually caught up with him. Parliamentary investigations exposed the extent of the overcharging. Ouvrard was imprisoned in 1824 and remained in prison until 1829. He reportedly lost 22 million francs of his own money through personal advances that the government refused to repay. But by then, the damage was done. The Spanish expedition had cost more than double its authorized budget. Some of that money had gone to feed soldiers. Much of it had gone into the pockets of contractors like Ouvrard. So how did the 1823 invasion actually get financed? Let's put the pieces together. Layer 1. Parliamentary authorization. The French chambers voted 100 million francs, consisting of a 42 million franc budget surplus, plus 58 million francs in new bond issuance. 42 million surplus plus 58 million new bonds equals 100 million francs. Layer 2. The Rothschild loan. James de Rothschild's consortium actually raised approximately 370 to 380 million francs through bond sales, far more than the 58 million authorized. This provided a cushion for unexpected costs. Approximately 370 to 380 million francs raised Layer 3, the ouvrar provisioning. Much of the cost overrun, the difference between the 100 million franc authorization and the 200+ million actual cost, was consumed by ouvrard's inflated supply contracts. Approximately 75% of 107.8 million franc overrun Layer 4, Spanish debt. The war was supposedly fought on behalf of Ferdinand VII. France expected Spain to reimburse at least some of the costs. This Spanish debt to France would not be fully liquidated until 1862, nearly 40 years later. Not liquidated until 1862. The financing of the 1823 invasion reveals something important about how power worked in early 19th century Europe. Governments needed bankers. Without the Rothschild network, France could not have raised the capital necessary for the Spanish expedition. The established French banks lacked the international reach. Government bonds needed to be sold to investors in London, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam, not just Paris. Only the Rothschilds could do that. But bankers also needed governments. The Rothschilds made their money by lending to states. Their wealth depended on governments remaining solvent and paying their debts. A revolution that repudiated government bonds, a war that bankrupted the treasury, would destroy the foundation of their business. This created a strange alignment of interests. The Rothschilds were not ideologically committed to absolutism. They were committed to stability, to creditworthiness, to the predictable functioning of the state. They had financed Napoleon's enemies, then Napoleon himself, then Napoleon's enemies again. They would finance whoever was in power and whoever could repay. The 1823 loan was good business. The French government was creditworthy. The war was likely to succeed. The bonds would be repaid. That the operation would result in thousands of executions and a decade of repression was not the Rothschilds' concern. This is where the story gets morally complicated. James de Rothschild did not invade Spain. He did not execute Rafael del Riego or hang El Empecinado. He did not create the Juntas de Purificación or the Voluntarios Realistas. He simply sold bonds. But those bonds financed the army that enabled the invasion that enabled the repression. Without the Rothschild loan, the expedition might have been delayed, might have been scaled back, might have failed for lack of funds. Does that make the banker responsible for the deaths? It's a question that has no easy answer. Wars require financing. Financing enables wars. Where does the money end and the blood begin? What we can say is that the Rothschilds emerged from 1823 richer and more powerful than before. They had proven they could finance a major military operation. They had displaced established competitors. They had become essential to French government finance. Over the following decades, they would become perhaps the most powerful private financial institution in European history. They would finance railroads, industrial development, a colonial expansion. They would be ennobled, celebrated, and resented. The 1823 loan was not the foundation of their fortune. Nathan's coup during the Waterloo campaign had already made the London house enormously wealthy. But 1823 marked James's breakthrough in Paris. It established the pattern that would define Rothschild operations for generations. Finance the operation. Collect the profits. Move on to the next deal. The bond market stabilized. The bankers counted their profits. But the consequences of the 1823 invasion were only beginning to unfold. Because the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis didn't just change Spain. They changed the world. The invasion that succeeded beyond anyone's expectation sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. It provoked responses that would reshape the Western Hemisphere. and it accelerated the collapse of an empire that had stood for 3 centuries. That story comes next. To truly understand what James de Rothschild accomplished in 1823, you need to understand where his family came from. The Judengasse in Frankfurt was a single narrow street, barely 12 feet wide in places, where Frankfurt's Jewish community had been confined since 1462. By the 18th century, nearly 3,000 people lived in about 190 houses, crammed into a space designed for a few hundred. Jews could not own land outside the ghetto. They could not enter the city's parks. They could not walk on the certain streets. They had to step aside when Christians passed. They paid special taxes for the privilege of existing. At night, the gates of the Judengasse were locked, trapping everyone inside, and they were forbidden from most professions. They could not join guilds. They could not practice most trades. They were pushed into the few occupations Christians disdained: money-lending, peddling, dealing in second-hand goods. It was into this world that Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744. Mayer Amschel's father was a trader in coins and cloth. When both parents died in 1755, the 11-year-old orphan went to Hanover to work for a banking firm. He learned accounting, learned about finance, learned about the aristocratic world beyond the ghetto. He returned to Frankfurt and established himself as a dealer in rare coins and antiquities. It was a respectable trade that brought him into contact with wealthy collectors, including aristocrats with money to invest. His breakthrough came through Wilhelm IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. Wilhelm was one of the wealthiest princes in Europe, a man who had made a fortune renting his subjects as soldiers to the British during the American Revolution. He needed people to manage his investments, collect his debts, and conduct financial business that he couldn't handle directly. Mayer Amschel became one of Wilhelm's agents. He proved himself reliable, discreet, and competent. The relationship deepened over decades. When Napoleon's army swept through Germany in 1806, Wilhelm fled. Much of his fortune was entrusted to Mayer Amschel Rothschild for safekeeping. The ghetto Jew was now managing the wealth of princes. Mayer Amschel had 10 children who survived to adulthood, including 5 sons. His genius was recognizing that the future of finance was international, and that his 5 sons could create something unprecedented, a family network spanning European capitals. Each son had different strengths. Amschel, the eldest, was cautious and conservative, suited for managing the Frankfurt headquarters. Salomon was diplomatic, able to navigate the complex politics of the Austrian Empire. Nathan was aggressive and brilliant, perfect for the ruthless environment of London finance. Karl was steady and adaptable, able to establish the family in Naples. James, the youngest, combined charm with ambition, perfect for the glittering world of Paris. Amschel, Frankfurt; Salomon, Vienna; Nathan, London; Karl, Naples; James, Paris; Mayer. Amschel sent each son to establish a banking house in a different capital. They would operate independently but coordinate constantly. Money information would flow between them faster than between any government agencies. Capital could move across borders instantly. The family developed a private courier system. Messages traveled between London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples faster than through any official postal service. They communicated in a mix of German, Yiddish, and Hebrew, with a private code that outsiders could not decipher. The legend of Rothschild financial genius was cemented in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. As Wellington and Napoleon fought in Belgium, European financial markets waited in agonized uncertainty. A French victory would transform Europe. A British victory would confirm the existing order. Fortunes depended on knowing the outcome before anyone else. Nathan Rothschild's courier network got him the news before anyone else in London. He knew Wellington had won while the official dispatches were still traveling. What exactly Nathan did with this information is disputed. The famous story that he manipulated the market by appearing to sell, causing a panic, then buying at the bottom, is probably exaggerated. But there's no doubt that he profited enormously from advanced knowledge of Waterloo. By 1823, Nathan was probably the richest man in Britain. His brothers were establishing dominance in their respective capitals. The family's combined wealth exceeded that of most European states. James de Rothschild arrived in Paris in 1812, at age 20, during the last years of Napoleon's empire. He was the youngest son sent to the most challenging market. Paris was dominated by established banking families with generations of connections. Jacques Lafitte, the Perrier brothers. The old Protestant banking dynasties, they looked down on this German Jewish newcomer. James was an outsider in every way: foreign, Jewish, young, lacking social credentials. He advanced slowly. He handled some government business, made loans to the restored Bourbon monarchy, built relationships with officials who valued discretion and reliability. But the really big contracts, the prestigious loans that established a bank's reputation, remained out of reach. James was hungry. He had something to prove, both to the French establishment and to his older brothers. He needed a breakthrough contract, something that would demonstrate that de Rothschild Frère belonged at the top table of French finance. The Spanish War loan was exactly that opportunity. To understand why the Rothschilds were different, you need to understand how government borrowing worked before them. In earlier eras, kings borrowed from individual lenders or small syndicates. The loans were often personal arrangements, secured by specific revenues or assets. If the king defaulted, the lender might seize a tax farm, a crown estate, or some other tangible property. By the early 19th century, governments were increasingly borrowing through bond markets. They issued standardized securities, government bonds that could be bought and sold by anyone with money. This allowed governments to tap a much broader pool of capital. But there was a problem. Bond markets were still largely national. French investors bought French bonds. British investors bought British bonds. A Paris banker could sell bonds in Paris, but had limited reach in London or Frankfurt. The Rothschilds could sell the same bonds in multiple markets simultaneously. When James bid on a French government loan, he wasn't just committing Paris capital. He was committing London capital through Nathan, Frankfurt capital through Amschel, Vienna capital through Salomon. This meant the Rothschilds could place larger loans than any competitor. They could absorb more risk. They could offer governments better terms. And they could move capital across borders in ways that made national boundaries almost irrelevant. Beyond raw capital, the Rothschilds offered something else: reliability. Government finance in this era was risky. Governments defaulted. Wars disrupted tax collection. Revolutions overthrew regimes that owed money. Any banker who lent to governments needed to assess these risks carefully. The Rothschilds developed a reputation for lending only to governments they believed could repay. They didn't chase bad risks. They demanded collateral. They structured their loans to minimize default risk. This reputation became self-reinforcing. Because the Rothschilds were careful, their loans were seen as safe. Because their loans were seen as safe, investors were willing to buy Rothschild underwritten bonds at higher prices. This meant the Rothschilds could offer governments better terms than competitors, winning more business, strengthening the reputation further. When the French government announced it would borrow to finance the Spanish invasion, James saw his chance. The established French banks naturally expected to win the contract. They had the relationships, the track records, the social standing. Rothschild victory would be an upset, but James had prepared carefully. He had coordinated with his brothers. He knew he could distribute bonds not just in Paris, but in London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. He could commit more capital, offer better terms, and guarantee wider placement than any purely French bank. When de Rothschild Frère won the 1823 loan, the French financial establishment was stunned. The outsider had arrived. The next 2 decades of French government finance would be dominated by James de Rothschild, and it all started with financing an army that would crush a democratic revolution. The French invasion of Spain in 1823 was designed to restore one king to absolute power. It succeeded, but its consequences rippled outward in ways that nobody predicted. Within a year, the United States would proclaim a doctrine that shaped Western Hemisphere politics for 2 centuries. Within 2 years, Spain would lose its last major colonial possessions in mainland America, and the European Congress system, the framework that had governed international relations since Napoleon's defeat, would begin its terminal decline, all because France sent an army across the Pyrenees. In the summer of 1823, as French troops besieged Cadiz, American diplomats watched events in Europe with growing concern. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, President James Monroe, and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, faced a difficult question. If the Holy Alliance could intervene in Spain to crush a constitutional government, what would stop them from extending that intervention across the Atlantic? But Spain's American colonies had been fighting for independence since 1810. By 1823, most of mainland Spanish America was effectively free. Mexico had declared independence in 1821. Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador had formed Gran Colombia under Simón Bolívar. Peru was fighting its final battles against royalist holdouts. Argentina and Chile had been independent for years. But none of these new nations had been formally recognized by the European powers, and Spain, under Ferdinand VII, had never renounced its claims to the colonies. If France could restore Ferdinand to power in Spain, might the Holy Alliance then help Ferdinand reconquer his American empire? The British were thinking along similar lines, but for different reasons. George Canning, the British Foreign Secretary, had commercial interests to protect. British merchants had been trading with the newly independent Latin American nations. British investors had been making loans to the new governments. If Spain reconquered its colonies and reimposed the old colonial trading restrictions, British commerce would suffer. In August 1823, Canning approached the American minister in London, Richard Rush, with a proposal. What if Britain and the United States issued a joint declaration opposing any European intervention in the Americas? The proposal was tempting. A joint declaration would carry more weight than either nation acting alone. Britain had the world's most powerful navy. If Britain committed to opposing reconquest, the Holy Alliance would have to think twice. Rush forwarded the proposal to Washington. The Monroe cabinet debated it intensely. Former Presidents Jefferson and Madison, consulted by Monroe, both recommended accepting the British offer. But John Quincy Adams disagreed. Adams argued that accepting the British proposal would make the United States a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. America would be the junior partner in a British-led initiative. The declaration would appear to require British permission. It would bind American freedom of action to British policy. Better, Adams argued, for the United States to issue its own declaration. Let America speak for itself. Let America define its own policy toward the Western Hemisphere without European guidance. There was another factor Adams didn't say out loud, but certainly considered. The British proposal included a commitment that neither nation would seek to acquire any Spanish-American territory. Adams didn't want to foreclose future American expansion. Texas, California, Cuba, these were already on the minds of American expansionists. A commitment not to acquire territory might prove inconvenient. Monroe was persuaded. The United States would act alone. On December 2, 1823, President Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress. Buried within a long address covering many topics were several paragraphs that would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. The key principles were three. First, the Americas were closed to further European colonization. The political system of the Allied powers, meaning the Holy Alliance, was fundamentally different from that of the Americas. Any attempt to extend their system to the Western Hemisphere would be considered dangerous to American peace and safety. Second, the United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of European powers or in existing European colonies. This was the quid pro quo. America would stay out of Europe if Europe stayed out of America. Third, any attempt by European powers to oppress or control the newly independent nations of the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as an unfriendly act toward the United States. In essence, Monroe was claiming the entire Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence. European powers could keep their existing colonies, but they could not acquire new ones. and they could not restore control over nations that had already won their independence. The European reaction was not impressed. A Metternich called the Monroe Message an indecent declaration. The Russian foreign minister thought it very extraordinary. Most European powers simply ignored it, and they had reason to dismiss it. In 1823, the United States had a tiny navy and a negligible army. It could not actually prevent European intervention in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was a statement of aspirations, not capabilities. What actually prevented European reconquest of Spanish America was not American declarations but British policy. The Royal Navy dominated the Atlantic. British commercial interests demanded Latin American independence. When George Canning obtained French assurances in October 1823 that France would not seek colonial acquisitions in Spanish America, the threat of reconquest effectively ended. But France disclaims colonial ambitions in Spanish America. Canning later boasted, "I called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the old." But the Monroe Doctrine would outlast British naval supremacy. Over the following century, as American power grew, the doctrine would be invoked to justify everything from opposing European intervention to justifying American intervention. It became the foundation of American policy toward Latin America, for good and ill, for 200 years. And it was announced in direct response to France's invasion of Spain. While diplomats debated in European and American capitals, the real action was happening on South American battlefields. By late 1823, Spanish colonial power in mainland America was reduced to Peru and Upper Peru, modern Bolivia. Viceroy José de la Serna commanded approximately 9,000 royalist troops, but his position was weakening. The independence forces under Simón Bolívar and Antonio José de Sucre were closing in. Then came news from Spain. Ferdinand VII had been restored to absolute power. Constitutional government had been crushed. Liberal officers who had sympathized with colonial independence were being purged from the Spanish military. For the royalist forces in Peru, this should have been encouraging. Their king was back in power. Reinforcements might eventually come. But the news had an unexpected effect on one critical royalist commander. General Pedro Antonio Olañeta commanded royalist forces in Upper Peru. He was an absolutist, a man who believed in undiluted royal power. He had no sympathy for liberal constitutionalism. When news arrived that Ferdinand had been restored and the Constitution abolished, Olañeta should have celebrated. Instead, he rebelled. Olañeta's problem was with Viceroy La Serna and the other senior royalist commanders in Peru. They had supported the Constitution during the Trienio Liberal. They had cooperated with the liberal government in Madrid. In Olañeta's eyes, they were traitors to the king, regardless of Ferdinand's restoration. In early 1824, Olañeta refused to obey orders from Lima. He turned his approximately 4,000 troops away from fighting the independence forces and toward a private war against his own side. He demanded the dismissal of all constitutionalist officers. The royalist position in Peru was already precarious. Olañeta's revolt made it impossible. On December 9, 1824, the independence forces under General Antonio José de Sucre met the main royalist army at Ayacucho in the Peruvian highlands. Sucre commanded approximately 5,800 to 6,000 patriots. Viceroy La Serna commanded about 9,300 royalists. The royalists had the numbers, but their position was untenable, with Olañeta's forces in rebellion behind them, with no hope of reinforcement from Spain, with morale collapsing. They were fighting a battle that could not change the war. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The royalist army was routed. Viceroy La Serna was captured. Approximately 1,400 royalists were killed and 700 wounded. 14 royalist generals fell into patriot hands. 1,400 killed, 700 wounded. 14 generals captured Viceroy. Captured. The capitulation signed that evening granted generous terms to the defeated royalists. Officers could keep their property. Soldiers could go home or join the patriot forces. La Serna and his generals would be allowed to return to Spain. The Battle of Ayacucho ended Spanish colonial rule in South America. Bolivia declared independence on August 6, 1825. Of Spain's vast American empire, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remained. Ferdinand VII's restoration had cost Spain its colonies. The irony is almost too perfect. The Holy Alliance invaded Spain to preserve European stability. The invasion triggered the Monroe Doctrine, which would eventually exclude European power from the Western Hemisphere entirely. Ferdinand's restoration triggered Ollañeta's rebellion, which split the royalist forces in Peru, which enabled the Patriot victory at Ayacucho, which ended Spanish colonial rule in America. The Congress of Verona, which authorized the intervention, was the last great Congress of the post-Napoleonic era. Britain's breach with the Continental powers over Spain was never repaired. The Congress system died. The 100,000 Sons of St. Louis achieved everything they set out to achieve. They invaded Spain, crushed the constitutional government, restored Ferdinand VII to absolute power. They did it quickly, cheaply, and with minimal casualties. And within a decade they had lost Spain the last remnants of its American empire, provoked an American doctrine that would reshape hemispheric politics for 2 centuries, and destroyed the international system that had governed Europe since Waterloo. In Spain itself, Ferdinand VII's restoration led to a decade of terror, followed by more instability. Ferdinand died in September 1833 without a male heir. His widow, Maria Cristina, served as regent for their infant daughter, Isabella. The ultra-royalists who had supported Ferdinand refused to accept a female succession. They rallied around Ferdinand's brother Carlos. The result was the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict that killed over 100,000 people. The Voluntarios Realistas, the 200,000-strong militia that Ferdinand had built, largely sided with Carlos. The liberals, freed from exile by Ferdinand's death, supported Isabella. Spain would be racked by Carlist conflicts for decades. The ideological divide between liberal constitutionalists and ultra-royalist absolutists, the same divide that had produced the Triennial Liberal and the French Intervention, would poison Spanish politics throughout the 19th century and beyond. The Constitution of 1812, despite being abolished 3 times, became a template for liberal constitutions across Europe and Latin America. Its principles proved more durable than the absolute monarchy that crushed it. So what does the story of the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis tell us? It tells us that military success is not the same as lasting success. France won the war. Ferdinand won his throne. But the consequences spiraled far beyond what anyone intended. It tells us that money and power are inseparable. Without the Rothschild network, France could not have financed the invasion. Without the Ouvrard contracts, the costs would have been lower. The war was fought by soldiers but enabled by bankers. Lesson 2. Money and power are inseparable. It tells us that repression creates its own opposition. Ferdinand killed thousands, but he could not kill the idea of constitutional government. The liberals returned. The Constitution inspired new movements. The harder he crushed, the more determined his opponents became. It tells us that international systems are fragile. The Congress of Verona was supposed to preserve European stability. Instead, it revealed the fractures between Britain and the continental powers. Those fractures never healed. Lesson 4. International systems are fragile. And it tells us that history is full of irony. The invasion designed to preserve the Spanish Empire helped destroy it. The intervention designed to demonstrate monarchical power provoked an American doctrine of hemispheric independence. The bankers who financed absolutism built fortunes that outlasted the monarchies they served. Today, Spain is a constitutional monarchy. The current constitution was adopted in 1978, after the death of the dictator Francisco Franco. It establishes parliamentary democracy, regional autonomy, and protection of individual rights. The direct line from Ferdinand VII to this outcome is long and bloody. It runs through multiple civil wars, a republic, another dictatorship, and decades of struggle. But the principles that Rafael del Riego proclaimed in 1820 eventually triumphed. The Himno de Riego, banned after Riego's execution, became the anthem of the Spanish Republic. It remains a symbol of the liberal tradition that Ferdinand tried so hard to destroy. The 100,000 sons of St. Louis are largely forgotten. Their invasion succeeded brilliantly and meant almost nothing. The money that financed them built a banking dynasty. The king they restored became a byword for tyranny, and the world they tried to preserve slipped away despite their victory. 1823. That is the story of how France bought an army, crushed a democracy, and changed the world in ways nobody expected. Total script word count, approximately 21,000 words. Total runtime, 90 minutes. 200 years have passed since the 100,000 sons of St. Louis crossed the Pyrenees. The world they inhabited is almost unrecognizable. The Holy Alliance is dust. The Congress system died at Verona. The monarchies that trembled before revolution have mostly become constitutional democracies or disappeared entirely. The Rothschild family still exists, still in banking, though dwarfed by institutions they could never have imagined. The patterns they pioneered, international capital markets, sovereign debt trading, cross-border financial networks, now govern the global economy. And Spain. Spain is a parliamentary democracy, a member of the European Union, a nation where the principles of 1812, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, individual rights, are so normalized they barely merit discussion. The liberals won. It just took them 2 centuries. So what does this story tell us about how history actually works? First, it tells us that intervention has consequences that interventionists cannot predict. France invaded Spain to restore stability. The invasion triggered the Monroe Doctrine, accelerated Spanish colonial collapse, and destabilized the international system that France was trying to protect. Every goal was achieved. Every outcome backfired. This pattern recurs throughout history. Powers intervene to stabilize, and their interventions destabilize. They suppress revolutions, and their suppression creates martyrs. They restore order, and the order they restore contains the seeds of greater disorder. Second, it tells us that money is never neutral. The Rothschild loan didn't just finance the invasion, it enabled it. Without reliable financing, the French government might have hesitated, might have scaled back, might have abandoned the project. The bankers didn't pull the trigger, but they loaded the gun. This dynamic continues today. Defense contractors, sovereign wealth funds, international investors all shape what governments can and cannot do. Financial markets reward certain policies and punish others. The line between private profit and public power has never been clear. The Rothschilds were not uniquely evil. They were pragmatic. They financed whoever could repay, regardless of what the money would be used for. This pragmatism made them rich and made them essential. It also made them complicit in things they personally had no stake in. Modern finance operates on similar principles. Capital flows where returns are highest, regardless of consequences. The question of where money goes and what it enables is always present, always uncomfortable, always deferred. Third, it tells us that ideas survive their advocates. Ferdinand VII executed Rafael del Riego. He killed El Empecinado. He hanged Mariana Pineda. He drove thousands into exile. He erased the constitutional government as if it had never existed. And the Constitution of 1812 became a template for liberal constitutions across Europe and Latin America. Its principles shaped the Spanish Republic. Its echoes sound in modern democratic institutions. The men and women who wrote it are mostly forgotten, but their work endures. Ferdinand won every battle and lost the war. His version of Spain, absolute monarchy, alliance of throne and altar, rule by decree and secret police, is extinct. The Spain of 2023 would be unrecognizable and horrifying to him. The Spain of 2023 is what the liberals of 1820 hoped to build. Fourth, it tells us that international orders are more fragile than they appear. The Congress system looked solid in 1822. The great powers had cooperated for 7 years. They had crushed Italian revolutions. They had managed French reintegration. They seemed to have established a durable framework for European stability. Verona broke it. Britain's refusal to endorse the Spanish intervention created a breach that never healed. The Continental powers went ahead without Britain. Britain pursued its own interests in Latin America. The unified European concert splintered into competing blocs. The pattern would recur. European great power cooperation would give way to competing alliances, arms races, and eventually catastrophic war. The system that tried to prevent revolution ended up producing something far worse. Today's international institutions, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the WTO, all face similar pressures. They look stable until they break. They manage conflicts until they can't. The question is always whether the center will hold. Fifth, it tells us that the end of colonialism is not the end of the story. Spain lost its American empire partly because of the 1823 invasion. The new nations that emerged, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and the rest, faced centuries of struggle with the colonial legacy. Independence did not bring prosperity or stability. The new nations inherited colonial economic structures, social hierarchies, and political patterns. They became economically dependent on Britain and later the United States. They experienced civil wars, dictatorships, and foreign interventions. The Monroe Doctrine, announced in response to the 1823 invasion, became a justification for American intervention throughout Latin America. The United States opposed European colonialism, but often replaced it with American hegemony. The doctrine meant to protect Latin American independence was invoked to constrain it. The colonial legacy persists. Economic inequality, racial hierarchies, institutional weakness, all trace back to patterns established under Spanish rule. The 100,000 Sons of St. Louis accelerated the end of formal colonialism, but they could not accelerate the end of colonialism's effects. Finally, it brings us back to the question we raised earlier. Where does the money end and the blood begin? James de Rothschild sold bonds. The bonds financed an army. The army enabled a restoration. The restoration enabled a decade of terror. How much of that blood is on the bankers' hands? The question hasn't gone away. Today we debate ethical investing, divestment campaigns, sanctions regimes. We ask whether banks should finance fossil fuels, weapons manufacturers, authoritarian governments. We argue about the responsibility of investors for the consequences of their investments. There are no easy answers. Capital always enables something. The question is what it enables and whether the enablers bear responsibility. James de Rothschild would probably say he just did his job, just made a loan, just collected a return. The liberals who died in Ferdinand's prisons might have a different view. It's easy to tell this story as abstraction. Great powers, international systems, financial networks, historical forces. But these were real people. Rafael del Riego was a 34-year-old officer who believed Spain deserved better than Ferdinand VII. He was dragged through the streets and hanged. El Empecinado spent 6 years fighting Napoleon to save Spain, then was hanged by the king he had saved. Mariana Pineda was a young mother who refused to betray her friends. She was strangled by a machine designed to kill slowly. Behind them were thousands more whose names we don't know. Political prisoners who died in dungeons, families destroyed by purification commissions, exiles who never returned home, ordinary people caught up in forces they couldn't control. History is made of human suffering and human hope. The abstractions, the systems, the forces are just shorthand for countless individual experiences. The 100,000 Sons of St. Louis were individual French soldiers, most of whom probably had no idea they were changing history. Their victims were individual Spaniards, each with their own story, their own hopes, their own terror at the end. Take the longest possible view. In 1823, Ferdinand VII crushed Spanish liberalism and restored absolute monarchy. In 1833, he died, and Spain plunged into civil war. In 1868, another revolution. In 1873, a republic that lasted less than 2 years. In 1931, another republic. In 1936, another civil war. In 1939, another dictatorship. In 1975, the dictator died. In 1978, a democratic constitution. 1823, Constitution crushed. 1833, Civil War. 1868, Revolution. 1873, Republic 1931, Republic 1936, Civil War. 1939, Dictatorship. 1975, Transition. 1978, Democracy. It took 155 years, but the principles that Riego proclaimed in 1820, that Ferdinand crushed in 1823, that generations fought and died for, eventually prevailed. The Constitution of 1978 establishes popular sovereignty, separation of powers, individual rights, everything the Constitution of 1812 promised. Spain is a democracy. The liberals won. The 100,000 sons of St. Louis are a footnote now. They won their war. They crossed the Pyrenees, took Madrid, besieged Cadiz, restored their king's cousin to absolute power. They did in 6 months what Napoleon couldn't do in 7 years. Then they went home and were mostly forgotten. James de Rothschild became one of the richest men in France. He financed railroads, development projects, governments across Europe. He was ennobled, celebrated, and resented in equal measure. The 1823 loan was just the beginning of his career. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, hated by liberals and distrusted by the ultra-royalists, who thought he hadn't been brutal enough. His legacy was civil war and his daughter's troubled reign. The liberal exiles returned after Ferdinand's death. Many of them had spent a decade in London, Paris, or Latin America. They brought back new ideas, new experiences, new connections. Their exile had spread Spanish liberalism further than their rule ever had. How France bought an army, crushed a democracy, and changed the world. This is the story of how France bought an army, crushed a democracy, and changed the world. It's the story of kings and bankers, generals and guerrillas, idealists and opportunists. It's the story of how one invasion triggered consequences that nobody predicted, reshaped the Western Hemisphere, and accelerated the collapse of an empire. And it's the story of ideas that proved more durable than the armies sent to destroy them, believing that Spain deserved better.